The air in the square was thick with dust and despair. It tasted like the end of the line. Ella McKinley stood on a crude wooden platform, her hands bound tight with rope that bit into her skin. She kept her eyes fixed on the splintered planks beneath her feet, trying to count the cracks, trying to focus on anything other than the 100 pairs of eyes staring at her. They weren't seeing a person. They were seeing property, a commodity. The auctioneer's voice was a greasy boom, a sound perfected through years of selling off lives and dreams. A fine specimen, gentlemen, 24 years old, healthy and trained in all the womanly arts. She can cook, she can clean, and she'll warm your bed on the cold frontier nights. Who'll start the bidding for this prime piece of stock? A bitter laugh threatened to escape Ella's throat. A letter had brought her here. A lie folded into an envelope, promising a new life, a respectable husband, a chance to escape the poverty of Boston. Instead, it led her to Hallow Creek, a town that felt more like a purgatory, and delivered her to this block. A mail-order bride, they called it. It was a prettier name for a slave. Her gaze flickered up, just for a second, scanning the crowd of leering faces, weather-beaten miners, grimy farmhands, men with cold, empty eyes that appraised her like she was a horse they were thinking of buying. A knot of pure, cold dread tightened in her stomach. This was it. This was the end of her story. $20! A man with a tobacco-stained beard shouted, tossing a few coins onto a barrelhead. $25! Yelled another, his voice cracking with eagerness. The bidding crawled upward. 30, 35. Each number was a hammer blow against her soul. She thought about the promise in that letter. A lie. They were all lies. But what choice did she have? No family, no money, no hope. She had traded a slow death in a Boston tenement for a fast one out here in the wilderness. $75. A burly man at the front roared. He was big, with hands like shovels and a cruel smirk on his face. He looked at her like he'd already bought and broken her. This was it. This would be her owner. Her heart sank into a dark, bottomless pit. She braced herself. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and refused to let them see her break. But then, something shifted. A ripple went through the back of the crowd, a subtle parting of the bodies. A figure emerged from the long shadows of the morning, moving with a silence that was more powerful than all the shouting. He was tall, dressed in worn leather and buckskin that seemed to be a part of him, not just clothes he wore. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, a panther stepping into a yard full of chickens. His face was hard, carved from stone and wind, with a jaw set in a permanent line of defiance. But it was his eyes that stole the air from Ella's lungs. They were dark, intense, and held a wildness she'd never seen before. He wasn't leering. He wasn't appraising. He was just looking, straight at her, and in that single soul-piercing gaze the entire world fell away. The noise, the heat, the fear, it all vanished. For the first time since she'd arrived in this God-forsaken land, she felt seen. The auctioneer, lost in his performance, didn't notice at first. 75 going once, 75 going twice. A lifetime of comfort for a pittance, gentlemen. The crowd, however, had noticed. The murmuring started, a low hum of confusion and unease. Who was this stranger? He didn't belong here. His silence was a challenge, an accusation. The auctioneer's voice finally faltered as he saw where everyone was looking. Going to 100. The voice was low, rough like stones grinding together, but it cut through the air like a razor. It wasn't a bid, it was a statement. The tall, silent man hadn't shouted. He had simply spoken, and the world had stopped to listen. The auctioneer blinked, completely thrown. The burly man who had bid 75 turned, his face red with anger. Who in the hell? The stranger ignored him. He took a single step forward, and his presence seemed to consume the space. His eyes never left Ella. He reached into a pouch at his belt, not pulling out coins, but a small, intricately beaded medallion. He tossed it onto the barrelhead. It landed with a soft, heavy thud that sounded louder than any gunshot. "That covers it," he said. Not to the auctioneer, to the world. The auctioneer stared at the medallion, his face going pale. He recognized it. A flicker of pure, undiluted fear flashed in his eyes before he masked it. He swallowed hard, his bravado vanishing like smoke. "Sold!" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. To the gentleman." A stunned silence fell over the square. Jaws hung open. The burly man looked like he wanted to fight, but one look at the stranger's cold, unblinking stare and he seemed to shrink. What was happening? What was that medallion? The stranger finally turned his full attention to Ella. He walked onto the platform, produced a knife from his belt, and with one clean slice, cut the ropes binding her wrists. The freedom was so sudden it made her dizzy. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, meant only for her. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and strode toward the edge of the town, expecting her to follow. For a half-second, Ella was frozen. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and raw, primal fear, but her feet were already moving. She stepped off the block, leaving her old life behind in the dust. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, whispering and staring. She didn't know who this man was. She didn't know where he was taking her or why he'd bought her with a mysterious token instead of money. But as she followed his silent, confident back out of Hallow Creek, one thought echoed in her mind. He hadn't looked at her like a possession. He'd looked at her like a mission. And for the first time in forever, she felt the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of being alive. The man didn't speak as they left the town behind. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that settled over them. Ella expected him to say something, anything, an explanation, a command. But there was nothing. Just the steady rhythm of his boots on the dusty trail and the clip-clop of two horses he untied from a post at the edge of town. One was a powerful black stallion, the other a more modest brown mare. He gestured to the mare. "Get on." It wasn't a request. Ella hesitated. "I'm not much of a rider." His dark eyes met hers. There was no impatience in them, just an unyielding expectation. "Learn," he said. There was no arguing. She clambered onto the horse's back, her movements clumsy and awkward. She grabbed the reins, her knuckles white. The man swung onto his own horse in one fluid motion, a seamless extension of the animal. He didn't offer a word of instruction or encouragement. "Don't fall off," he muttered, more as a statement of fact than a piece of advice. He nudged his stallion forward, and they were moving, heading out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open wilderness. The silence returned, broken only by the wind and the sound of hooves. Ella focused on staying upright, her muscles screaming in protest. She kept her eyes on the man's back. He rode with a straight spine, constantly scanning the horizon, never looking back, but she felt his awareness of her like a physical touch. Who was he? An outlaw, a bounty hunter. His clothes were simple but well kept. He moved with the quiet deadliness of a man who lived by his senses. Hours bled into one another under the oppressive sun. The landscape shifted from dusty plains to rocky, scrub-filled hills. The world felt ancient and hostile. Any one of these canyons could be hiding an ambush. Any shadow could hold a threat. Finally, he spoke, his voice startling her out of a heat-induced daze. "We're heading north, need to be out of their reach." Ella's mind seized on the words. "Their reach?" she asked, her own voice hoarse. "The men from the auction?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "The men they work for." A chill went down her spine despite the blistering heat. The auction wasn't just some local, sordid business. It was part of something bigger, something organized. And this man, this stranger, had just walked in and thrown a wrench in the machine. That beaded medallion hadn't been a payment. It had been a message, a threat. What in God's name had she just walked into? They stopped as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky. He dismounted with that same effortless grace and began to make a camp near a small, trickling creek. He moved with an economy of motion, building a small, smokeless fire, unpacking jerky and hardtack. He did it all without a word, as if he'd been alone for years and had forgotten how to share a space with another person. Ella finally slid off her horse, her legs so stiff she nearly collapsed. She had to know. She couldn't stand the silence, the not knowing, for another second. "Why?" she blurted out, the word raw and desperate. "Why did you buy me?" He didn't look at her. He continued to arrange the kindling, his focus absolute. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the scent of sage and dust. She thought he was going to ignore her, to let the question hang in the air and die. Then he turned his head, his eyes catching the flicker of the new flames, and she saw it, a flicker of something else in their depths. Not anger, not pity. Something that looked like recognition. "You look like her," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Ella's breath caught in her throat. "Her? Who?" He turned back to the fire, the mask of indifference slamming back into place. "My wife," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, but they hit Ella with the force of a physical blow. "She's dead." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't about saving her. This wasn't about justice. He had looked at her on that auction block and seen a ghost. She was a replacement, a stand-in for a dead woman. The hope that had flickered to life inside her just hours ago was brutally snuffed out. She hadn't been rescued. She had just been traded from one cage to another, this one built of a stranger's grief. He didn't say another word. He handed her a piece of jerky and a canteen, then settled by the fire, his back to her, a solitary figure lost in a darkness far deeper than the coming night. Ella ate without tasting, her mind reeling. She wasn't a person to him. She was a memory, a painful echo he had paid $100 and a mysterious medallion for. What did he expect from her? To play the part of his dead wife? To fill a void that was carved into his very soul? The thought was horrifying, more chilling than any of the leers she'd faced in the square. Later that night, long after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she was startled awake by a sound. Not an animal, not the wind. It was the sound of a man's voice, choked with anguish. She sat up, her heart hammering. It was him. He was asleep, but in the grip of a nightmare. He tossed and turned, his hands clenched into fists. "No," he muttered, the word torn from his throat. "Silas, don't—" Silas. The name hung in the cold night air. Who was Silas? What had he done? Before she could process it, his eyes snapped open. He wasn't looking at the sky or the rocks. He was staring directly at her, his gaze wide with a raw, terrifying panic. But he wasn't seeing Ella. "Naya," he whispered, his voice broken. They told me you were gone." He was seeing his dead wife, and in his eyes she saw the full, horrifying truth. He hadn't just bought her because she looked like his wife. He had bought her because he genuinely believed in some broken part of his mind that she was his wife, returned from the grave. She wasn't in a cage made of grief. She was trapped in a cage made of madness. The morning broke, cold and gray, and with it came a sanity that was almost as terrifying as the madness of the night before. The man, he still hadn't told her his name, was awake before her, his back already to the fire, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, metallic, and scraped along Ella's raw nerves. He didn't mention the nightmare. He didn't mention the name Naya. He acted as if it had never happened. He was once again the silent, stoic stranger from the auction block. But Ella couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unhear the raw pain in his voice. She was sitting across a fire from a man whose mind was a fractured thing, a mirror broken into 1,000 pieces. "We ride in 10 minutes, he said, not looking at her. His voice was flat, controlled. Ella packed her few belongings, her hands trembling. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to steal the mare and ride as fast and as far as she could. But where would she go? Back to Hallow Creek and the auction? Into the wilderness to die of thirst or be taken by predators of the two-legged variety? She was trapped by the vast emptiness of the land, and trapped by the broken man who was now her keeper. They rode north again, the silence even heavier than before. Ella watched him, studying the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. Was he dangerous? Was his grief a quiet sorrow, or a simmering rage waiting to boil over? The name he'd uttered in his sleep echoed in her head. Silas. It sounded like a curse. Late in the afternoon, they came upon a trading post. It was a miserable-looking shack, a blemish on the landscape, with a sagging porch and a sign that had long ago lost its paint. A few tough-looking men loitered outside, their eyes cold and watchful. They stopped talking as Ella and the stranger approached, their gazes lingering on Ella with a familiar predatory hunger. The stranger dismounted. "Wait here," he commanded. He strode into the trading post, his spurs ringing on the warped floorboards. Ella stayed on her horse, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The men outside didn't move, but she could feel their eyes on her, stripping her down, weighing her value. Minutes stretched into an eternity. What was he doing in there? Finally, he emerged, carrying a canvas sack of supplies. But something was wrong. His jaw was tighter, his movements sharper. The air around him crackled with a new, dangerous energy. As he was tying the sack to his saddle, the door to the post creaked open again. A squat, greasy man with a rat-like face stepped out. It was the auctioneer from Hallow Creek. Ella's blood ran cold. What was he doing here? The auctioneer, whose name was Barlow, swaggered toward them, a smug look on his face. Well, look what the buzzards dragged in. Grey Wolf. Thought you'd be halfway to the territories by now. Grey Wolf, so he had a name, it fit him. Lonely, wild, and dangerous. Grey didn't turn around. He continued securing the supplies, his movements precise and deliberate. You've got a long reach, Barlow. My employer has a longer one, Barlow sneered. He took a step closer, his eyes flicking to Ella. You caused a real stir taking his property. He doesn't like it when people touch his things, especially when they use an Apache peace token to do it. That was a declaration of war, in case you were too stupid to know. So that's what the medallion was, a peace offering from a past conflict, one this employer had clearly violated. She's not his property, Grey said, his voice dropping to a deadly low temperature. He finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Barlow take an involuntary step back. Isn't she? Barlow laughed, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. She was on his block, in his town. That makes her his, and he wants her back, along with your head. He gestured to the men loitering on the porch. These boys are here to escort you both back to see Mr. Croft. Croft, not Silas. Mr. Croft, the name from Grey's nightmare. This was the man who haunted his sleep. This was the man who owned the town, the auction, everything. Grey's hand moved so fast it was a blur. One moment it was empty. The next, the long, gleaming blade of his knife was pressed against Barlow's fleshy throat. The other men reached for their guns, but froze when they saw the look on Grey's face. It was not the face of a grieving man. It was the face of a killer. Here's what's going to happen, Grey breathed, his voice a venomous whisper. You're going to get on your horse, and you're going to ride back to Silas Croft. You're going to tell him that Grey Wolf is coming for him. You're going to tell him I'm coming to finish what he started. And you're going to tell him that if he ever sends men after this woman again, I will burn his whole world to the ground. Barlow was sweating, his eyes wide with terror. He nodded frantically. Grey held the blade there for a second longer, then retracted it with a flick of his wrist. Go! Barlow scrambled for his horse, not even looking at his hired men, and galloped away as if the devil himself was on his heels. The hired guns looked at each other, then at Grey, who stood there like a statue of vengeance. They slowly backed away, mounted their horses, and rode off in the opposite direction. They wanted no part of this. Grey stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, the rage slowly receding. He had declared war, for her, or for the ghost he saw when he looked at her. He finally turned to Ella, his expression unreadable again. But the illusion was shattered. He wasn't just a broken man lost in grief. He was a man on a mission. A dangerous, deadly mission of revenge against this man, Croft. And by buying her, by seeing his dead wife's face in hers, he had just dragged her right into the heart of his war. She wasn't a replacement for his wife. She was his battle standard, the living symbol of his rage. And she had a horrifying feeling that, to win his war, he would be willing to sacrifice his standard. As they rode away from the trading post, leaving the dust and the fear behind, a new, terrible thought took root in Ella's mind. Gray hadn't bought her to protect her. He hadn't bought her because he was crazy. He had bought her to use her. He had bought her as bait. The revelation struck Ella with the force of a physical blow. She was bait, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a war she wanted no part of. She watched Grey Wolf's back as he rode ahead, the set of his shoulders now looking less like grief and more like grim determination. Every step the mare took was carrying her deeper into his quest for vengeance. Her fear began to curdle into a slow, burning anger. She had been sold, bought, and now she was being used. Her life was still not her own. She had simply been passed from one master to another. They rode until the sun was low, and the sky was bruised with twilight. Gray found a defensible spot to camp, nestled in a circle of tall, weathered rocks. He moved with the same efficiency, but now Ella saw it for what it was, the practiced routine of a soldier, not a lonely wanderer. As he built the fire, she finally broke the silence. "Croft," she said, the name feeling like poison on her tongue. "Silas Croft. He's the one who killed your wife, isn't he?" Gray froze, his hand hovering over a piece of firewood. He didn't look at her, but she saw his whole body tense. It was a long moment before he answered, his voice tight. "Yes. And you're going to kill him." It wasn't a question. "Yes." The simplicity of his answers was more chilling than any long-winded explanation. He was a man honed to a single purpose. "And me?" she pushed, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "What am I in all this? Why buy me? Why not just ride into his town and face him?" He finally turned to her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so deep, it momentarily extinguished her anger. "Because I couldn't," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've tried. For 2 years I've tried. His fortress, his town, it's impenetrable. He has too many men, too many eyes. I could never get close." He looked away, staring into the dancing flames. "Then I heard the rumors, about the auctions, about a new woman who had arrived from the east. They said she was Naya's mirror image, a ghost walking in the sun." He finally looked at her again, and his gaze was pleading. "When I saw you on that block, it was like the spirits had given me a sign. A key." "A key?" Ella repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "You mean bait. You think he'll hear about me, that he'll want the ghost of the woman he murdered, and he'll come out of his fortress, or that he'll let me in." Gray didn't deny it. He just nodded, his face a mask of grim resolve. "He's a collector of beautiful things, and he's a superstitious man. The story of Naya's ghost returning, it will be irresistible to him. It's my only way in." The cold, calculated truth of it stole her breath. He had confessed. He was using her resemblance to his dead wife as a psychological weapon against his enemy. Her life was the price of his vengeance. "So you expect me to just, what, walk into the lion's den? Let him take me so you can get your shot?" she asked, incredulous. "I will not let him harm you," Gray said, his voice a low growl. "I will be there. I will protect you." "Like you protected her?" The words were out before Ella could stop them, cruel and sharp. The impact was immediate and devastating. All the strength seemed to drain out of Grey Wolf. He flinched as if she had physically struck him, his face crumbling into an expression of such profound agony that Ella felt a pang of regret. He sank to the ground, burying his face in his hands. "No," he choked out. "I didn't protect her. I was a scout for the army. I was away. Croft and his men, they were supposed to be prospectors. They wanted the water rights on our land. Our tribe refused. So he made an example of us. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. They burned our village. I came back to nothing, just ashes and bodies. He took her from me. He took everything. The dam of his silence had broken, and a flood of grief and guilt poured out. Ella stood frozen, her anger washed away by the tide of his pain. This wasn't a cold, calculating killer. This was a man shattered by loss, trying to piece himself back together with the only thing he had left: revenge. She didn't know what to do, what to say, so she did the only thing she could. She sat down, not too close, but not far away. She just sat, sharing the silence with him as the fire crackled and the stars emerged in the vast, indifferent sky. They were two broken people in a broken land, a woman who had lost her future, and a man who was chained to his past. Suddenly, Gray's head snapped up. He wasn't crying anymore. He was listening. His entire body went rigid, his senses on high alert. "Get down!" he hissed, his hand already on his rifle. Ella dropped to the ground behind a rock without a second thought. She heard it then, the faint, almost inaudible sound of a twig snapping in the darkness beyond the firelight. It wasn't an animal. The silence that followed was too deliberate. They weren't alone. Gray moved like smoke, melting into the shadows at the edge of the camp. He was no longer the grieving husband. He was Grey Wolf, the warrior. Ella held her breath, her heart pounding against the hard ground. Who was out there? More of Croft's men? Had Barlow led them right to them? There was a sudden flurry of movement in the darkness, a blur of motion, and then a body slammed into the dirt, just feet from the fire. It was one of Croft's men from the trading post. Before he could cry out, Gray was on him, a knife to his throat. "Who else is with you?" Gray demanded. The man was terrified, his eyes wide. Just me," he stammered. "Barlow sent me back, to watch you, report where you were headed." But it was a lie. A flicker of movement in the trees behind him gave it away. Another man, rifle raised. "Gray!" Ella screamed. Gray reacted instantly, shoving the man on the ground aside and rolling just as a gunshot ripped through the night air, splintering the rock where his head had been a second before. The night exploded into chaos. Gun flashes lit up the darkness from multiple directions. It wasn't just two men. It was an ambush. A half-dozen of them at least. They were pinned down, surrounded. Gray returned fire, his rifle barking in the darkness. He was a brutally efficient fighter, moving from cover to cover, his shots precise. But they were outnumbered. It was only a matter of time. A bullet ricocheted off a rock near Ella's head, showering her with stone chips. This was it. This was how it ended. Killed in a stranger's war. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the nature of the fight changed. The gunshots from the attackers began to cut off, replaced by choked cries and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. But the shots weren't coming from Gray. They were coming from the darkness behind the ambushers. Someone else was out there. Someone silent. Someone deadly. An arrow, fletched in black, sprouted from the chest of a man aiming at Gray. He collapsed, without a sound. Another attacker fell, a tomahawk buried in his back. A third figure was dragged screaming into the shadows. The remaining ambushers panicked. They were being hunted. They turned and fled blindly into the night, their terrified cries fading into the distance. Silence fell once more, heavy and absolute. Gray slowly stood up, rifle still ready, scanning the darkness. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice wary. A figure stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight. He was an Apache warrior, tall and lean, his face set in hard lines that made Gray's expression look soft by comparison. He carried a bow and a quiver of black-fletched arrows. He moved with a lethal grace, his eyes cold and assessing. He looked at Gray, then his gaze shifted to Ella, and it held no warmth at all. It held something else. Disapproval. "You are a fool, brother," the warrior said, his voice flat and hard. Brother. This was his brother. Cale, Gray breathed, a mixture of shock and relief in his tone. Cale took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Gray. The elders sent me. They said you had lost your mind to a ghost. I see they were right. He gestured dismissively at Ella. You have broken your oath. You were to let the past die. Instead you bring this complication into our war. You have put the mission at risk for a phantom. Gray's face hardened. She is not a phantom, and she is not a complication. She is a weakness, Cale snapped. Croft now knows you are alive. He knows you have this woman. He will not be drawn out. He will dig in. He will set traps. You have thrown away the element of surprise. All for what? For a memory? The truth of Cale's words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Gray's plan, born of grief and desperation, was flawed. He had let his emotions cloud his judgment. I am ending this, Cale. With or without you, Gray said, his voice low and defiant. No, Cale said, his eyes like chips of obsidian. We are ending this. The Council has decreed it. Croft's power has grown too strong. He poisons the land. He must be removed. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. But our way, not your reckless, grief-stricken path. Cale then turned his cold gaze back to Ella. As for her, she is a problem. The plan cannot work with a variable like her in the middle of it. A knot of ice formed in Ella's stomach. A variable. A problem. That's all she was to him. What are you suggesting? Gray asked, stepping slightly in front of Ella, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by his brother. Cale's expression was unyielding. She cannot be allowed to fall into Croft's hands. It is too great a risk, and she cannot be left to wander the wilderness. There is only one logical solution. His eyes were devoid of any emotion as he delivered the verdict. She has to be eliminated. The words hung in the cold night air, a death sentence delivered with the casual finality of a weather report. She has to be eliminated. Ella's blood turned to ice. She looked from Cale's stony, implacable face to Gray's. This was a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She had survived the auction, survived the ambush, only to be told she was a liability who needed to be erased. No, Gray said, the word a low, dangerous rumble. He moved to stand fully between Ella and his brother, his rifle held loosely but ready. The two brothers faced each other over the fire, two sides of the same warrior coin, one driven by hot grief, the other by cold logic. Do not be a bigger fool, Cale said, his voice laced with contempt. Your sentiment for this echo, is a weakness that will get us all killed. The mission is to destroy Croft and his entire operation, to reclaim what is ours. It is not to save one lost settler woman. She has a name, Gray bit back. It's Ella. Her name does not matter! Cale's voice rose for the first time, sharp as a whip crack. What matters is that Croft wants her. He will use her against you. He will torture her for information. Her very existence is a threat. Then we protect her, Gray insisted. Protecting her and attacking Croft are two different missions, brother. We do not have the men for both, Cale countered, his logic unassailable. You have forced my hand. By revealing yourself, you have accelerated the Council's plan. We move on Croft's stronghold at the next full moon. We cannot do that with a civilian in tow. Ella found her voice, shaky but clear. I won't be a liability, she said, stepping out from behind Gray. Both brothers turned to look at her. I won't be a victim, and I will not be eliminated. She looked Cale directly in the eye, channeling a strength she didn't know she possessed. Gray's plan was to use me as bait, to get inside. Your way, you attack from the outside. Why not do both? Cale stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. He had expected tears, pleading. He hadn't expected strategy. Explain, he commanded. You're right, Ella said, her mind racing, piecing together fragments of information. Croft won't be drawn out by a ghost story. Not now that he knows Gray is alive. He'll be paranoid. He'll lock himself down. She took a breath. But he's also arrogant. A man like that. He thinks he's a god in his own little kingdom. He collects things. He takes what he wants. She looked at Gray, then back at Kale. Your plan was to have me walk into his fortress. It was reckless, but the core idea, the key, is still sound. He wants me, so let him have me. Absolutely not, Gray growled. Let her speak, Kale ordered, holding up a hand to silence his brother. He was listening, truly listening, for the first time. You don't let me walk in, Ella continued, her plan forming as she spoke. You let him take me. Make it look real. You stage a fight, an ambush where you are overwhelmed. Gray is killed or driven off. His men capture me. I am not a willing key turning a lock. I am a prize of war, delivered right to his door. I am proof that he has finally defeated the ghost of Grey Wolf. She saw the understanding dawn on Kale's face. The cold logic of it appealed to him. He would take you to his inner sanctum, Kale mused. He would want to gloat. He would want to display his trophy. And I would be your eyes and ears inside, Ella finished. I can learn the layout, the number of guards, his routines. I can find a weakness, a way for your warriors to get in when the time is right. It was a terrifying, insane plan, a suicide mission, but it was her plan. For the first time, she was not a pawn. She was a player. She was choosing her own fate, seizing control from the men who had tried to dictate her life. Gray looked at her, his face a storm of conflict. He saw the logic, the brutal effectiveness of her idea, but he also saw the woman he had sworn to protect volunteering to be the sacrificial lamb. I won't allow it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's too dangerous. Living is dangerous, Ella shot back, her gaze locking with his. Standing on that auction block was dangerous. Riding through this desert is dangerous. At least this way, I'm fighting for something, for my own freedom, and for yours. She looked pointedly at the haunted expression on his face. You want to be free of him, don't you? Free of the past? The argument was over. She had won. Kale gave a single sharp nod. The girl has a warrior's spirit, he conceded, the closest thing to a compliment he was capable of. And a sound plan. It is a great risk, but the potential reward is everything. He turned to his brother. We will do it her way. We will stage the ambush in 2 days' time, in the Canyon of Whispers. Croft's patrols pass through there daily. His face was grim. You will have to make it look convincing, brother. You will have to lose. The thought of Grey Wolf, the fearsome warrior, having to fake his own defeat was a bitter pill. But he looked at Ella, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and he knew there was no other way. He had seen her as a ghost, a replacement for his lost Naya. But now, he was finally seeing her. Ella, a woman of impossible courage. 2 days, Gray agreed, his voice heavy. For the next 2 days, the camp was a hive of tense activity. Kale, a master strategist, drilled Ella relentlessly. He taught her how to observe, how to listen, how to map a location in her mind. He taught her about Silas Croft, his habits, his ego, his cruelty. He was preparing a lamb for the slaughter, and he was chillingly thorough. Gray was quieter, more withdrawn. He taught Ella something different. He taught her how to use a small knife she could hide in her boot. How to find the weak points in a man's body. Not to fight an army, but to survive a single, desperate moment. Each lesson was a silent admission of his terror, a prayer that she would not have to use it. In the quiet moments, a new, fragile understanding grew between them. The ghost of Naya was fading, replaced by the reality of Ella. He was no longer her keeper, and she was no longer his pawn. They were allies, comrades in a war that was now about more than just his revenge. It was about her liberation. The morning of the ambush arrived, gray and ominous. They stood at the edge of the Canyon of Whispers, a narrow, winding passage of red rock. His patrol will be here within the hour, Kale said, materializing from the rocks like a spirit. He had a dozen of his best warriors hidden in the cliffs above. Gray turned to Ella. The time had come. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, hers was small, but it didn't tremble. Be brave, Ella, he whispered, his voice thick. I learned it from you, she whispered back. He pressed something small and metal into her palm and closed her fingers around it. This was hers, he said. Naya's. It's a locket. Croft gave it to her. Before. He couldn't finish the sentence. He will recognize it. It will make your story more believable. Ella looked down at the simple silver locket. It felt heavy with history, with love and with death. She was literally carrying this man's past into the heart of his enemy's fortress. A distant sound echoed through the canyon, the clatter of hooves on rock. They're coming, Cale hissed. Take your positions. Gray gave Ella's hand one last squeeze, his eyes boring into hers, trying to convey a lifetime of unspoken words. I will come for you, he vowed. I swear it on my soul. Then he let her go. He and a handful of Cale's warriors took up a defensive position in the center of the canyon floor. Ella scrambled up a short slope to a designated spot, a place where she would be discovered after the fight. From there, she could only watch. The patrol rounded the bend. It was led by a man with a scarred, brutal face Ella recognized instantly. Jedediah, the burly man who had tried to buy her at the auction. He was Croft's head dog. A perfect, hateful coincidence. Jedediah saw Gray and his men, and a cruel, triumphant grin split his face. Well, looky here. It's the wolf out of his hole. Croft will be mighty pleased. He and his 20 men drew their weapons, confident in their numbers. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire and war cries. It was a performance, but a deadly one. Cale's men, pretending to be Gray's, fought with savage fury, selling the deception with their blood. They were outnumbered, and slowly, convincingly, they were losing. Gray fought like a cornered demon, a whirlwind of motion and violence, but it was all for show. He was deliberately letting himself be pushed back, overwhelmed. Finally, Jedediah saw his moment. He charged Gray, and the two men locked in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. Gray fought him off, then, as planned, he stumbled, catching his foot on a loose rock. Jedediah slammed the butt of his rifle into Gray's head. Gray collapsed to the canyon floor and lay still. Ella's heart stopped. Even knowing it was fake, the sight of him falling, so convincingly lifeless, ripped a genuine scream from her throat. The scream did its job. Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the rocks. He saw her. Well now, he grunted, wiping blood from his lip. The boss said we might find his little ghost. Looks like he was right. He barked orders to his men. The wolf is dead! Find the girl! Croft wants her alive! Ella scrambled back, making it look like a desperate escape attempt. Two of Croft's men caught her easily, their hands rough as they dragged her down to the canyon floor. Jedediah loomed over her, his foul breath washing over her face. He saw the locket clutched in her hand and ripped it away. He opened it, saw the tiny portrait of a smiling Apache woman inside, and grunted with satisfaction. Yeah, this is her all right, he said. Tie her up. We're taking her to meet her biggest admirer. As his men bound her hands, Ella risked one last glance at Gray's still form on the ground. His face was turned away, a pool of blood, a pouch of berry juice Cale had supplied, spreading in the dirt beneath his head. It was terrifyingly real. She was in their hands. The plan had worked. She was on her way to the lion's den. As they threw her onto a horse and led her away, she clung to Gray's last promise like a prayer. I will come for you. But as the canyon of whispers disappeared behind her, a new, chilling fear took hold. What if the act had been too convincing? What if Gray wasn't just pretending to be unconscious? What if she was truly on her own? The ride to Silas Croft's stronghold was a journey into the heart of darkness. His ranch, the Croft Dominion, wasn't just a home. It was a fortress carved out of the wilderness, surrounded by a high adobe wall and watched by guards on lookout towers. It was a monument to one man's greed and paranoia. Ella was dragged from her horse and shoved through a massive wooden gate into a bustling courtyard. It was a small, self-contained town, filled with hard-faced men who all wore Croft's brand, a stylized vulture, on their belts or saddles. They all stopped to stare at her, the captured ghost, their whispers following her like snakes slithering through grass. Jedediah shoved her toward a large, imposing main house, a 2-story hacienda that radiated wealth and power. "The boss is waiting," he snarled, pushing her through the ornate doors. The interior was a jarring clash of opulence and frontier brutality. Fine carpets covered the floors, but the walls were mounted with the heads of animals and an unnerving number of antique weapons. And sitting in a high-backed leather chair behind a massive oak desk was Silas Croft. He was not what Ella had expected. He wasn't a brutish thug like Jedediah. He was an older man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. He had the soft hands and placid face of a banker, but his eyes were ancient and cold, like a lizard's, holding a complete and utter lack of empathy. It was in his eyes that you saw the vulture. "Mr. Croft," Jedediah said, puffing out his chest. "We got her, and Grey Wolf is dead. I killed him myself." Croft's cold eyes flickered from Jedediah to Ella. He held out a soft, manicured hand. The locket. Jedediah placed it in his palm. Croft clicked it open and stared at the tiny portrait for a long, silent moment. A strange, thin smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of happiness. It was a smile of possession, of ultimate victory over a long-dead enemy. "Naya," he murmured, his voice a soft, cultured whisper that was more menacing than any shout. He looked up at Ella, his gaze traveling over her face, her hair, her form. It was the most violating stare she had ever endured. "The resemblance is remarkable, utterly remarkable." He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward her, circling her like a predator inspecting its prey. "They say a spirit cannot cross running water, yet here you are, a ghost made of flesh and blood." "I am not a ghost," Ella said, her voice steady despite the terror coiling in her gut. "No, of course not," Croft said soothingly. "You are just a poor, lost girl who had the misfortune of being saved by a savage I have now put in the ground, finally ending a long and tedious affair." He stopped in front of her. "You have nothing to fear from me, my dear. You are a guest here, my special guest." He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was like ice. "Jedediah, take our guest to the Rose Room. See that she is made comfortable. Give her a bath, new clothes. We must show her that civilization is far preferable to the company she was keeping." Jedediah grabbed her arm. "This way, guest," he sneered. As he dragged her from the room, Croft's final words followed her. "We will talk later, my dear. We have so much to discuss." The Rose Room was a gilded cage. It was a luxurious bedroom with a soft bed, silk sheets, and a window that looked out over the courtyard. The window was fitted with iron bars. They gave her a bath, laid out a beautiful silk dress for her, and left her alone. The door was locked from the outside. She was a prisoner. The first part of her plan had succeeded. Now came the hard part: survival. For 2 days, Croft left her alone, attended to only by a silent, grim-faced maid who brought her food and refused to speak. It was a battle of nerves. He was letting her stew, letting the isolation and uncertainty break her spirit. Ella used the time to study. She watched the guards' patrol patterns from her window. She noted the layout of the buildings she could see. She listened to every sound, every footstep in the hall, building a mental map of her prison. On the 3rd day, Croft summoned her to his study again. "I hope you have found your accommodation satisfactory," he said with his thin smile. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit." Ella sat, her back ramrod straight. "I have been doing some research on you, Ella McKinley," he said, steepling his fingers. "An orphan from Boston, no family, no connections. You came west seeking a new life and you found me." He leaned forward. "A truly fascinating coincidence. Almost fateful." There was something in his tone, a sly, knowing quality that set Ella on edge. I was a scout for the army, you know, Croft continued conversationally. Long before I made my fortune, I knew the Apache. I even negotiated a treaty with Grey Wolf's tribe, a peace treaty. His eyes darkened. They had something I wanted, water rights. They refused to sell. They were proud, foolish. He picked up a letter opener, toying with its sharp point. So I took what I wanted, and I removed the obstacles. It was business. Grey Wolf never understood that. He thought it was personal. You murdered his wife, Ella stated, her voice cold. I disciplined a recalcitrant tribe, Croft corrected smoothly. Naya was an unfortunate casualty of progress, but her death, it did give me an idea. He paused, his reptilian eyes fixed on her. You see, after the massacre, Grey Wolf became a ghost, a thorn in my side. I needed a way to draw him out, to finish him for good. He smiled that terrible, thin smile again. So I sent a letter to a Boston orphanage, a letter promising a new life in the West to a very specific girl, a girl whose description, provided by a very well-paid associate back east, was an almost perfect match for my dear departed Naya. The floor dropped out from beneath Ella's world. The letter, the promise of a new life. It wasn't a random mail-order bride scam. You? She whispered, her mind refusing to process it. Yes, my dear, Silas Croft said, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. I brought you here. I arranged for your journey. I made sure you would end up on Barlow's auction block. I knew the story of a ghost would eventually reach Grey Wolf. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist. Her entire journey, her suffering, her rescue. It was all a lie. She had never been a pawn in Grey's game. She had been a pawn in Croft's all along. He had baited a trap for Grey Wolf, and she was the cheese. Your plan didn't work, she managed to say, her voice trembling. Grey didn't walk into your trap. He sent me. Croft laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Oh, my dear, sweet, naive girl. You think you are here as his spy? You think you came up with that clever little plan all on your own? He leaned back, his victory absolute. Who do you think leaked the information about my patrols in the Canyon of Whispers? Who do you think whispered in Cale's ear that an inside man was the only way? I have had a man inside their war council for months. It couldn't be. Cale? No, someone else. Someone trusted. You are not his spy, Ella, Croft said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You are my invitation. You have just invited Grey Wolf and his entire band of warriors to walk into the greatest trap this territory has ever seen. The full moon is tomorrow night, and when he comes for you, my men will be waiting. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his dominion. He will not die from a simple bullet to the head this time. I have something much more personal in mind for him, and you, my dear, will have a front row seat. The hope she had been clinging to, the image of Grey and Cale and their warriors storming the gates, turned to ash in her mouth. She hadn't led her rescuers to a secret weakness. She had led them all to their graves.